Ah! Hello. I'm soaking wet and it is freezing. But it's time to talk about the areas after the beginning. The areas after the beginning. I wouldn't necessarily call this the area after the prologue, but I would call it once the status quo is established and a pattern is being made out of the issues our characters face within a story. Now, it's a little wordy, I know, I get it, but the idea is that the area after the beginning is sort of the World 2, when the tutorials are mostly done and you're getting a sense of what the rest of this game, what the rest of this world will look like. The formula has been established, and having a good formula can make or break a game, especially when you get to these World 2s. See, I feel like a lot of games run into this issue where you're either committed for way too long to get to a point way farther along with a pattern that's just not doing it for me, or nothing changes whatsoever and you're kind of stuck in the same formulaic nonsense with no challenges towards the status quo, which kind of ends up leaving you feeling unfulfilled within a story. I can't be the only one who feels that way. For me, it comes down to the gameplay and the story, right? If you have good gameplay, it doesn't matter if the story's great, and if you're in a slower section, you're speeding up. A good game allows you to learn the mechanics in a way that still makes you feel like a badass. And when you have that, I see that personally in games like Celeste or Ultra Kill, where you're allowed to move super fast and it feels like it's constantly challenging you without babying you along. But the gameplay's gotta be fun, right? RPGs can sometimes struggle from that thing where it's not really difficult, they kind of just pumped up the boss's levels and told you to grind for a bit. And sometimes they're kind of shit. It doesn't mean they're completely out of luck though. Of course, a good story can save it as well. The problem is, when you get to the area after the beginning, your story kind of can't have the most intense stakes of all time. You've kind of got to be at the point where a status quo has been established, right? If you're going to tell a story, it can be told with this crazy bombastic thing, but how are you going to follow that up at the second part of your story? Not the third or the fourth or the fifth, the second part. It's a very tough thing to do because you're supposed to be building tension, but you can do it correctly. I think Persona 5 does it very well, where it allows the story to develop while still having pretty good stakes that amp up. It does what gameplay should be doing as well, where it still feels like the story is as intense as it's still egging you on for greater things to come. These areas after the beginning have the job of basically selling you on the game. Yes, the beginning can be super badass, but once you get to this part, the area after the beginning, this is really when you decide whether you're going to commit to a game or a story or anything. You can read the beginning of a story and be like, yeah, that was good, and then not come back to it. But if you get to this part and you get past this part, you're basically in it for the long run. Now, of course, that's not certain, but generally, that's the rule of thumb I go by. I don't really know if it's on my thumb. I'm just kind of saying phrases that sound cool. Problem for me, the areas after the beginning typically just feel in this middle ground of nothing. It's like when you're in a room that's slightly too warm, but like not warm enough where you're like dying, but like you can feel a little bit of sweat. Like it's just slightly annoying, and that's where I feel like a lot of areas after the beginnings fall, where you're almost a little frustrated with the lack of progress you're making, and everyone tells you the shit's gonna be good once you get there, but maybe this gameplay is just not grabbing you in the way it wants to, or maybe the story is just dragging out and none of the characters are enthralling you in the way as people told you they would. So you kind of have to figure out, are you gonna stick with it, or are you gonna leave? It's almost a sunken cost thing. Maybe not all the way at this point, but it is a decision you have to make. Gravity Rush. I think people love that game. It's a classic, but the first one, the gameplay is very, very samey. Now, it isn't necessarily bad, but they don't do anything to innovate or challenge the player beyond killing more enemies. There comes a certain point where you meet all of the enemy types, and they don't do anything beyond that. And the gameplay becomes samey, and I'll be honest, the story of that game did not grab me whatsoever. I've made it through it because the aesthetic, maybe that's a discussion for a different day, aesthetic saving a game or whatever, but generally, you don't want that to be the case, where it just feels like something's dragging on, and it doesn't feel like anything's happening. You also see that in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, where every single World 2 is a desert. Why is that? Why did they choose a desert? Why does it go from grassy plains to desert? What makes them think, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be? That's the laws of the world. After that, it's not super certain, but like, still, weird as freak. Okay, sorry for my language, I'd like to apologize in advance, but they struggle with not amping the gameplay and saying they have a good story. Come on, bro, I could read you Humpty Dumpty and it has a better story than average Mario game. For me, a game that does it almost perfectly is TUNIC. TUNIC is a wonderful game at continually progressing the difficulty while still feeling like you're supposed to be in the locations you are. It allows it to open up a little bit, give you some choices, but once you get past the beginning, it still is difficult as hell. The story is enthralling while still having very, very little words, yet there's something there. Of course, the stakes aren't the highest they'll be because you don't understand what's going on, assuming you haven't played it before. If you have, I mean, okay, well, whatever, I'm not talking to you then. But it asks you the question of, where is this story going? And it intrigues you enough where you're engaged in the gameplay and you're engaged in the story. So areas after the beginning aren't necessarily hell. I enjoy areas after the beginning. You see them in so many games. I enjoy them in Ultra Kill. I enjoyed them in TUNIC. Undertale, you remember Snowden. Everyone remembers Snowden. And when they're done right, if the story catches you, you are committed by this point. And it doesn't necessarily mean the story is having its most intense, jaw-dropping, inspiring, iconic moments here. It means it's done enough to the point where you feel like it's worth it to see it to the end. Whether that be because you know the end product's gonna be awesome, or because you're just genuinely enjoying the characters they've established. The area after the beginning is a very tough thing to do for gameplay, because you have to continuously challenge the player while not making it boring and not making it frustrating. It's a tough balance to find. These stories are not necessarily bad. When I say something has a slow area after the beginning, it's not a bad thing. It's just sometimes it is a harder sell overall. Getting you enthralled in these characters is what the area after the beginning is supposed to do. It's where you're supposed to start feeling that connection, you know? You don't become best friends with somebody just by meeting them for the first time and having a few key moments together. It's everything in between that builds up to that. And if a game is able to do that very well, then the area after the beginning might not stand out the most, but it'll be what built those iconic moments up the best. That being said, is this my area after the beginning?